This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Starting today's show is the Henry C. Gardiner Global Food Systems lecturer, Gregg Doud. He discusses what opportunities Kansas producers have and what makes him excited for the future of agriculture and K-State. K-State Extension Farm Management Specialist Gregg Ibendahl continues the show by reviewing his recent work on researching cash rent prices in Kansas. Concluding today's show is K-State Dairy Specialist Mike Brouk. He says with nationwide beverage milk sales continuing to decline, other dairy products are seeing increased sales, and it prevents producers an opportunity to switch some of their fluid milk sales into higher demand products. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with the Henry C. Gardiner Global Food Systems lecturer, Gregg Doud. Gregg, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Gregg, before we get started, can you just tell us a bit about yourself?
I am from Mankato, Kansas. Grew up on a farm in north central Kansas. Traditional wheat, corn, soybeans, hogs, cattle. Was a 4-H'er and a state FFA officer and AGR here at K-State. So then I was animal science pre-vet, and then a master's in ag econ. So I'm refer to myself as kind of the full ag pedigree.
As you make this trip back to Kansas State University, what has it been like?
Well, I've been back to K-State many, many times, and of course, nieces and nephews that have gone here and have been to many K-State ball games over the years, and I used to work at the rec center, so I always kind of appreciate visiting with folks out in that part of the world. So this is still home. After all, I've been in Washington, D.C. 31 years now, but Manhattan and Mankato are still home. And after
K-State, what are a few different things you've done?
So I've been the economist for the wheat industry, chief economist for the cattlemen in D.C., worked for Senator Roberts on the Senate Ag Committee, traveled in about 44 countries and over the years, and now was President Trump's chief agricultural trade negotiator. Have worked a couple of years in the private sector here, and this is my, fifth week on the job now, I think, as the COO and incoming CEO of the National Milk Producers Federation. So really unique as an animal scientist and ag economist to have done the grain side of the equation, done the livestock side of the equation, and now I'm doing dairy, which is, one of the more interesting commodities of them all, I guess.
A large scope there, and something you mentioned as an impactful moment was while you're at the cattlemen's and you got a call about mad cow disease.
Yeah, so this year, December the 23rd, will be the 20th anniversary of mad cow, and I was the guy in the office. Everybody else had gone home for Christmas that got the call from Dale Moore and USDA. And, of course, I was the trade guy, so we lost all our export markets the next day. And I spent the next 7 years working with everybody in the U.S. government to try to reopen the Japanese market and the Korean market and the Mexican market and everywhere else around the world. And it was really that process of really heavy-duty trade work and being the chairman of the Ag Trade Advisory Committee that dealt with meat trade issues that developed the chops to be the ag negotiator. So that phone call, as bad as it was, that's what started it all.
And so what was that kind of stepping stone to your next career path?
Exposed you to what you needed to do in terms of working with the U.S. government. And I'm talking about the Foreign Ag Service, the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, the State Department, and other countries around the world to get beef exports, markets reopened again, and do all these things. And I think we've made a lot of great progress in those days. When I was at USTR, very humbled, and we talked about this, is opening the China market to U.S. beef for the first time. We got that one done in the phase one, and then we one of the great trade deals of all time, as far as I'm concerned, is the deal we did with Japan that really made a big impact for U.S. beef exports.
As listeners are kind of thinking about this, what are a few key points that you really wish they would take the time to understand?
Well, I think my message is very clear. We're in the food business. We're about protein. And if you look out 10 years in the future and look all around the world in terms of the supply and demand of protein, the supply of protein actually, when I'm talking about beef, pork, poultry, dairy, comes nowhere near meeting the demand. And if you have traveled and looked around like I have and studied this, really the only place on earth that can grow more of this stuff is here in the United States, here in North America. Asia, China, South America a little bit. The Europeans are going backwards. Our opportunity to grow more value-added beef, pork, poultry, dairy in Kansas, in the United States, is second to none. And so my charge as part of the Gardiner Lecture has been, let's go. Let's get after this. Our better days are ahead of us. Here at K-State and Kansas City, between us, we've got the Animal Health Corridor, we've got NBAF. These are the critical pieces of the puzzle, the future of this in terms of technology in making protein in an animal agriculture. We've got the technology, we've got the water and the grain and everything we need to do this. Let's get after it.
And you are the lecturer for the Henry C. Gardiner Global Food Systems event, and your title for your speech is The Future of Agricultural Trade, Geopolitics, and Food. And so how does geopolitics play into the future?
So last year, the U.S. exported $196 billion in food to the world. And believe it or not, the country that enters into this conversation more than anybody else is actually China. China last year imported $236 billion in food from the world. So you live in a world today where total Chinese food imports are about the same as total U.S. ag exports. These two countries, when it comes to food trade, are way above anybody else in the world. And so the geopolitics and the complications of the U.S.-China relationship really loom large in terms of what the price of corn or soybeans or cattle is going to be in the United States. So, I spent a year of my life in 2019 negotiating the China Phase 1 deal, where we fixed some 57 things in agriculture. And through the course of those conversations and negotiations, we learned a lot about each other, and we learned that really both countries, when it comes to food, we need each other. And despite all of the other geopolitics, we've got to continue to work on this. And it's going to have its challenges. There's no question about it. But I think a lot of our conversation was about technology. It was about biotechnology. It was about how China regulates versus how we regulate. And I think China was genuinely interested in learning how to apply and take a lot of what we discussed for their own self, obviously. But I think all of these things together, this combination of technology and what we're doing here and what our opportunities are outside the United States, it's really extraordinary. And, we've seen here in just the last few days what's happening in Israel and everywhere else. The world is a crazy place. And so if you're going to expand what you're doing internationally, there are things that you have to really, wrap your head around as well to understand what the risks are.
Obviously, agriculture is very important to Kansas and us here at K-State Research and Extension. And so how do you see kind of solving some agricultural problems? What's some key points to doing that? Well,
I think the solution, the way forward, is technology. And whether that's new herbicides and pesticides that are, biological in nature, naturally occurring, whether it's robotics in dairy, whether it's autonomous vehicles, that self-driving trucks. There are so many of these things that we're seeing and actually doing today. One of the other things that we were just talking about earlier today is food as medicine and the gut biome and the interrelationship between all of that on the nutrition side of the equation. The technology and what we are learning in agriculture is fascinating today. It is really accelerating in terms of the amount of investment going in this and some of the solutions that we're seeing as a result of this. We have to work with our government and from a policy perspective to get this technology commercialized and approved so we can get a return on investment on it. There is a lot of things to discuss. And from a K-State perspective, you're right in the middle of all this, whether it be on the NBAF side of the equation or whether it be on the animal nutrition and health side of the equation. K-State in terms of animal agriculture has always been in the middle of any conversation. And, I think you're having some conversations about maybe adding on around here. So that's a good thing as well.
What are you happy to see kind of K-State expanding on?
Well, I think in terms of what we're hearing or picking up on the changes at Weber Hall, that's pretty exciting stuff. I was here when we dated the meat science. That was a few years ago. I don't want to tell you how many years ago that was. But I think, K-State, to me, in all my travels, still represents the best undergraduates in agriculture in America. These are folks that are out there as leaders in agriculture and whatever industry in agriculture you want to talk about. That's K-State's bread and butter. That's what we've always done. And I hope we continue to do that very, very well, is crank out those future leaders for this industry.
And talking about expansion, currently you said you started a new job with the National Milk Producers Federation. And so talking about the dairy industry in Kansas.
Well, yeah, is there any industry that's growing faster than the dairy industry in Kansas? I'd like to know what it is. It is really changing rapidly what's going on out west, and I think there's enormous opportunities regardless of size and scale of a dairy anywhere in the U.S. Things are changing. The amount of opportunity on the export side has just exploded in the last few years. We're struggling a little bit right now with China, and that the whole world is, but I think that's going to come. And I think from my perspective, just started week 5 on the job with the National Milk Producers Federation, and on January 1, the creek don't rise. I'll be the new president and CEO, which means leading that conversation of what we want to do from a policy perspective for the dairy industry in the United States, and that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool that a farm boy from Jewell County, Kansas gets to do that.
And as you look forward, what makes you excited for agriculture and your position?
What excites me is the fact that our better days are ahead of us in agriculture in the U.S. and in the dairy industry as well. I think that we're growing, we're innovating, we're changing. K-State's got to do that right along with it, and they are. They're at the fore and all that, and so this is where it's at. It's great to be back.
And Greg, if you could put all of our Kansas ag producers in one room, so a lot of different commodities and different interests there, what would you tell them?
I would tell them that if you look globally longer term at the opportunity, especially on the beef side of the equation, on the dairy side of the equation, the pork side of the equation, it's going to be there. The profitability is going to be there. We can't make enough of this stuff globally to satisfy the demands around the world. So plan accordingly. Think through what you're doing from an investment standpoint. Think long term and get ready for what's to come.
What makes you the most excited to be back on campus today?
I don't want this to come across the wrong way, but when I went to school here, we won 3 football games in 4 years. And, the miracle in Manhattan and all the changes that have been made in terms of K-State over the years is I've followed every minute and every second of it. It's been great to watch and so proud of where we are today. This is a great state and a great university and great people, and proud to be a part of it.
That was the Henry C. Gardiner Global Food Systems lecturer, Gregg Doud. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show now discussing an outlook for irrigated and non-irrigated cash rents in Kansas. And we're joined by K-State Extension Farm Management Specialist Gregg Ibendahl to discuss it. Greg, thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
Greg, what's the purpose of these rental publications?
Well, we're not here to really make an endorsement for what this real price should be for a piece of ground. Like we're not giving a number and say, well, this is the amount you should be paying if you're a landlord and tenant for a piece of property, because there's a lot of variations that can go into the land rental thing in addition to land quality and stuff like that. So what we're really doing is we're trying to establish a starting point where people can negotiate from. I mean, I think that would help with the negotiation side. So you can either go higher or lower than what we think, depending on what your property value is and how productivity you see in your land. Some land may have better profitability than other pieces of ground even within a county. So that's one thing we're doing. And then we're also providing a range, like the 25th percentile, which would say basically, at 25th percentile, 75% of the farmers could probably cover this. And we go to the other end where you maybe see only 25% or more could actually get this kind of thing. And we give a whole range like that. So what we're really trying to do is have tenants and landlords come together and develop really what we call a fair rent. Now, fair rent doesn't imply there's a certain value attached to that. It's really what both the tenant and landlord agree that they think they can live with and they're satisfied with, as long as no one is holding a gun to their head and saying, well, this is the price you have to take. As long as both of them are happy with it, they negotiate in good faith, that's going to be an endorsement for our fair rent. And there could be other factors besides money affecting the whole thing. If you have a tenant you're real happy with, there's a lot of things for you. You might consider cutting them a break on the price. We've done that on my family farm back in Illinois. We have a tenant who basically worked with my dad when he had Parkinson's and did a real nice job, and it takes real good care of our farm. So we're cutting him a deal on the price. And there's all kinds of factors like that.
So a lot of different scenarios. And so, Greg, why do you take the time to produce this publication?
Well, really, every farm is going to be leasing some land, and there are surveys out there about what is the land rental price. But we kind of went on a different approach and looked at really what can farmers afford to pay, because the NASS survey, I mean, it's a good survey. They go through and every year they ask tenants, what prices are you paying for leases? But that includes not only new ground, but it includes ground that they maybe have rented for 4 or 5 years. And there's every incentive. I'm not saying farmers actually do this, but there's incentives for farmers really to maybe fudge a little bit on the price. Again, I'm not saying they actually do this, but they're asking you, and there's no penalties for reporting a wrong answer, I don't think. So really, there's every every incentive for farmers maybe to lowball things a little bit, and you have this delay factored in. Then you also have local conditions in play. There may be a whole bunch of farmers interested in a piece of ground. Maybe they're bidding up higher than what their actual productivity is. So the survey is actually quite a bit different than our approach to looking at the residual net farm income.
And so before we kind of go through what your approach is, Gregg, why is leasing so important to farmers?
Well, really, there's several reasons. The biggest, though, is land will never, ever cash flow. So you go out and you buy a piece of property, and you're paying X dollars in principal and interest payments. You will never generate enough income on that property to make that land cash flow. And that's really just the nature of farmland, because farmland is one of those unique assets out there that it never depreciates. And in fact, it actually appreciates in price, which really means a lot of your return to farming occurs because your asset value is growing and your equity value is growing, not so much that you're making actually that net farm income. And that's kind of unique to farming, because farmland does make about 80% of your farm assets. I mean, I always tell farmers, if you can find a piece of property that cash flows, yeah, you should buy that easily, because that's going to be a great deal. So the unique nature of farmland means that if we don't have enough income coming in to pay the principal and interest payments, where are we going to get the money to cover those things? Well, the answer for most farmers is we are actually going to have to go out and cash rent. And we see that when we look at the trends among farmers. So we see about 90% of our farms actually lease ground, which means only about 10% don't. And of those farms who do lease farmland, probably about 80% of their farmland base is actually rented ground here. So renting is very, very important to the whole mix for farmers when they're looking at their farm base and how they can generate enough cash to cover the ground they do want to buy. Because if farmers really had their preference, they would probably actually like to buy the farmland.
What's the approach that you went through for estimating these rates? Because it's not a survey.
No, yeah, NAS does that. So we're taking an entirely different approach. We're looking at, well, how productivity do you see from that farmland? So what we're doing is we're looking at really the net farm income you can generate. We use our KFMA data a lot in this analysis. So the KFMA data is really our backbone for providing, well, what does it cost to actually produce the different crops? And then combined with that, we're looking at really historical crop yields in a county when we have data from both NAS and FSA about that. We're looking at government payments. We are looking at potential crop insurance payments, really everything that would go into the entire mix for profitability. And then in addition, we are also subtracting out things you wouldn't see on a typical crop budget. So a typical crop budget would have both variable expenses like seed and fertilizer and fixed expenses like machinery. But then we also put a charge in for unpaid operator labor and also for management expense. So whatever, and that's full economic cost. Once you account for that, really anything left over can be used to go toward paying a cash run rate, and that's really our approach. And then we also look at like the recent history as a guide to what may happen in the future. So we're looking at really, in addition to this year and the coming years, we are also looking at the most recent 5 years of farm income too, and kind of average those across with a bigger weighting toward the more recent years. So
from all this work you've done, what did you find, Gregg?
Well, it may be surprising to some producers, but we're still seeing an increase, and maybe fairly significant in some regions, about what the cash rental rate may be on our per acre basis. And it's really because the last 8 to 10 years have been pretty profitable here in farming. It's almost like we're at a new level of net farm income, even though the expenses have jumped up. Certainly the income has gone up to match that. And some of our best years in our KFMA program have been in the last 10 years or so. So when you factor that in, we're probably looking at a fairly good size increase, especially in the Northeast. It's not so much in the western and central Kansas. Maybe we're probably looking at I would say under $5 to $10 an acre increase there. But in Northeast Kansas, we're looking at some bigger increases there. And again, we're trying to factor all those things in there and use a consistent approach so that we can kind of justify our numbers. And really, if you look at what's been happening on the land purchase market, we've seen a lot bigger jumps there than we've seen in the cash rental rate thing. I think some of these history of past leases is slowing down the increase you see from NAS. But really, based on just the current year's productivity and such, I think there should probably maybe bigger increases, at least for now. And again, that may change going in the future if productivity drops back off. So that's why we're seeing some increases in some parts of the state.
You're seeing some increases, but not nearly the increases that we're seeing in land values.
Yeah, I don't really think so yet. And again, it's this delay in older leases showing up in things. We actually kind of mitigate our survey that we do, our net tenants residual approach in with the NAS survey stuff. So what we're taking maybe 2/5 of the NAS survey, combining that with our data, really to get a more smoothing of the rental rate number that we predict. Otherwise, we'd have numbers jumping up and down really high each year because net farm income can be quite variable in Kansas. So we're using that really to kind of smooth our estimate.
So for rental rates, is there a big difference then between irrigated and non-irrigated?
Yes, there actually is, because there's a lot more income coming in on the irrigated side. Certainly with irrigated crop production in a state like Kansas, it can be very dry. You can get some pretty good corn yields at times. And the other thing that we have that makes the irrigated rents higher is that we are assuming center pivot irrigation, and we are assuming the landlord owns all that equipment. So that alone really adds about $70 per acre just to account for that. So when we combine higher net income, even though expenses are higher too, along with the fact that the landlord is probably going to own the irrigation equipment, that makes our irrigated equipment run rate a lot higher. And the other thing that I should say too, in addition to our NAS numbers for when we're doing this compared to NAS on the irrigated side, we're able to provide a lot of county estimates that NAS not able to produce just because they don't have enough irrigated farms in a lot of counties, and they're not able to use the little bit of data they do have, and they have to leave blanks in their results for that. We don't have that restriction because we're basing it on productivity, so we're able to fill in a lot of the blanks that NAS would have for that irrigated side.
Greg, we recently talked about net farm income projections, and obviously now we're talking about rent. And do you see any correlation there of increases and decreases? Yeah,
there should be a very strong correlation between those, because certainly we're looking at expectations of future profits driving the cash rental rate. So yeah, there should be a very strong correlation, not only with net farm income, but like I said earlier, with the land prices as well. All three of those should be highly correlated.
If people are wanting to find out what those numbers are for rental rates, where can they do that?
Well, AgManager should have the publication. I'm letting the ag lenders kind of look at this for a week or so to see if they think I'm in the ballpark anyway, because they're pretty close to the ground and know what farmers are paying out there. So once I get some feedback from them, it will be released on AgManager.
Greg, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some information about cash rents in Kansas.
Yes, thanks for being here.
That was K-State Extension Farm Management Specialist Gregg Ibendahl. His work can be found on AgManager, and his first piece is titled 2024 Kansas County Level Cash Rental Rates for Non-Irrigated Cropland, and the other one is titled 2024 Kansas County Level Cash Rental Rates for Irrigated Cropland. I will link both of these resources in today's show notes, which you can find on agtoday.net. The AgManager.info website does have all the information from Kansas State University's Agricultural Economics Department. You can search by topic or by contributor, and you can also find upcoming events. And one of those upcoming events that I'd like to remind you about is the Kansas Landowner Conference taking place November 10th here in Manhattan, Kansas. This conference is tailored to folks who have agricultural land in Kansas but do not reside on the property. I will also link that event in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll be joined by K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk as he discusses a potential opportunity for Kansas dairy producers.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. Starting in about 2010, the dairy industry saw a fairly dramatic decrease in the amount of fluid milk being consumed across the United States. Today, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says there continues to be a shift toward other dairy products and away from beverage milk, presenting producers an opportunity to utilize the volume of milk that would normally go into fluid milk sales in other dairy products that are in higher demand, such as yogurt and ice cream.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning milk sales across the United States in the last several decades. Milk sales, beverage milk, has been an important part of our dairy industry and continues to be a major way that consumers consume our products that we produce on our dairy farm. However, there have been some significant changes over time. For many years, fluid milk sales were pretty much stable in terms of total volume. Now, because of increases in population and those sorts of things, we saw a decrease in the per capita consumption of fluid milk. But starting about 2010, we started to see actually a fairly dramatic decrease in the amount of fluid milk consumed across the United States as a total amount rather than a per capita. And if we look at the total fluid milk consumption here in the United States since 2010, it's actually decreased by almost 21%. So that's a rather dramatic decline. Now, other dairy products have filled in to take up a lot of that extra milk that is available because consumers are not consuming it through fluid milk. But I think it does show a very long-term trend that is going to have an impact on us as dairy producers. So as we look at the types of milk that are consumed, there are some bright spots in the report. Number one, starting about in 2010, we reached a low point in whole milk sales. However, that has risen slightly and has maintained a fairly level volume. Might be surprising to you, since 2010 we've actually seen a fairly steady decline in lower fat milk sales. So seems as though consumers maybe trend toward the whole milk sales as opposed to lower fat options. However, the increase in whole milk sales is not made up for the losses that we've seen on the lower fat milk sales. Another trend that I've been watching over the time is fluid milk sales in terms of flavored milks. For a few years, we were actually seeing an increase in flavored milk sales across the United States, and since 2010, there's been a slight uptick, but that seems to have plateaued in the last 3 to 4 years, remaining fairly steady over that period of time, but not the increase that we had seen in the years before that. So as we look at milk sales across the United States, and what does that mean to us in the dairy industry, I think it points out a couple of things. There continues to be a fairly strong shift toward other dairy products and away from fluid milk sales or beverage milk. Yes, there are other choices in the refrigerated case today in the grocery store that probably add to that decline. But the general thing is we're consuming less milk as a beverage here in the United States. And I think this is particularly true with our younger population. So while we maybe can influence this slightly, I think we're going to probably have to think about utilizing the volume of milk that would normally go into fluid milk sales in other products, things like yogurt or ice cream or other products that seem to have the consumer's eye more than what fluid milk does. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. And this reminder to listen to the podcast version of Agriculture Today, visit agtoday.net, or using an app on your mobile device, type these search keywords, Agriculture, Today, Kansas, and you'll find this program. By tapping the subscribe button, brand new episodes of Agriculture Today will automatically arrive on your device. That's agtoday.net. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.